I want to present to you the results of the study I conducted as part of this workshop, but also as part of a special issue that Tobias edited together with another practical theologian. So what I'm presenting is already published, more or less, in the journal Praktische Theologie. It appeared in January, I think. You can find it under the citation here. The German title has Neuere entwicklungspsychologische Forschung im Spiegel von Review Studies, and that gives you an idea.
January of this year.
Yes, January of this year. Mm-hmm. Briefly about the background and my research objective. As you know, my field is religious education, and this is the field that I wanted to further a little bit in conducting this story. So why is developmental psychology of general interest to religious educators? For a long time, some developmental psychology has been part of the professional knowledge of teachers of religion in schools, especially in the sense that it's needed to interpret students' contributions in class correctly regarding their developmental state or stage. And ideally, our goal is to tailor our teaching opportunities, our teaching design to the learning needs and the developmental state of the students in religious education classes. And so in this sense, all religious educators have an interest in developmental psychology, and it has found its way into lots of textbooks of religious education. But the question is what is collected in the textbooks is getting on in age, shall I say. Some of the models that are presented there as highly relevant are more than 30 years old, and it's a small circle of research that is presented again and again and passed on as professional knowledge among teachers of religious education. So are there any insights to be gained from more recent psychological research? I wondered, can specifically this research be of assistance in tailoring teaching to the students' needs? Is there something new to find out? This was my research question, and my aim was to inform my own research community and comment on the findings. I want to say a little bit more about the background here. The models that are established knowledge in religious education are the stage models, large stage models of religious and moral development. James Fowler developed a model of stages of faith. Lawrence Kohlberg has a model of moral development or moral judgment, how it develops. And Oza and Gmünder adopted this model very straightforwardly for religious judgments. Both work with dilemma situations that the students comment on, and they would look at the forms of argumentation that students or young people in general use to solve or answer to the dilemmas. But these models more and more are gaining criticism, for one, because the population that was interviewed or studied to create the models, of course, is now in their 70s or 60s and 70s, and one has to assume that present-day students have a very different approach to the world, very different life world experiences. So the fit of these older models to present-day populations is questionable. Also, none of these studies were longitudinal studies, so the stages were constructed by interviewing or studying, questioning people of different ages, not the same people time and again. So the validity of the models themselves are being questioned more and more. And more could be said about the reliability or reliability of the stages that are described in these models. So in the absence generally of better models or a revision of these, religious educators in my field have started to conduct domain-specific research on religious learning with attention to individual topics or theological questions. For example, mostly in qualitative studies, we have studied, colleagues have studied the development of students' concepts of God, anthropology, of Christology, their image of Christ, how it might develop through learning input and over time. So this is the key term here is domain-specific interest. And this is mostly, as I said, to fill a gap of qualitative research on religious development, a perceived gap. This is what religious educators are doing themselves, not what they are getting from the field of psychology typically. Two terms that might be of interest if you want to pursue this further is children's theology or youth theology. These constructs mean the theology or the understandings that are formulated by the young people themselves. What did I do for my little study that I'm presenting to you? I was interested in the term development and how it is understood presently in developmental psychology. So I conducted a search of first just generally studies on PubMed and PsycInfo with the terms develop and development, religious or spiritual, with their derivatives in title or abstract. The mass was truly way too great of individual publications, so I narrowed it to only include review studies to get a better grasp of the general state of the discussion. Among the results that were still quite numerous, I identified three foci. The first was it was noticeable that the majority of these review studies, and hence individual studies also, are interested in the influence of religiosity or spirituality on the recovery from various illnesses. So a pathological interest, does it help the healing process among such cases of cancer would be an example, right? Very specific questions here. Secondly, and less so, the articles, the research concerned the training of medical personnel along the lines of spiritual care, assisting or taking care of patients with an eye to their spiritual or religious needs. And finally, quite a large number, surprisingly to me, concerned the problems that a religious environment may pose to implementing public health measures. Let's say, are blood transfusions accepted in a highly religious environment in certain countries? That would be one of those questions. Prevention of sexual transmittable diseases would be another. This sort of is these three foci collect the largest part of the research. None of these are of strong interest to religious education in schools. These are not obviously the aspects of religious development that we are most interested in. And so generally there were few studies concerning religious development in the sense that I presented initially, with an eye to students' understanding, their capability to engage with religious thought, that would be of interest to religious educators. But not for nothing, I did find some that were of import, I thought, namely two strands of recent empirical psychological research. The first concerns spiritual and religious development in the original older sense of Fowler, Kohlberg, Osack-Münder. This research seems to be a continuation of the stage model approach, which now strives to be more precise, to study new populations, and also to include more qualitative research. It strives to, anyway. And secondly, a strand that is interested in youth development outcomes, or what is sometimes called positive youth development, a set of broader developmental goals. And this strand studies how the achievement of such outcomes is related to religiosity or spirituality among young people. For each of these strands, there's at least a publication mass large enough to warrant review studies, and also such review studies that include an extended self-critical assessment of this field. This was a criterion for me to have review studies that are not only narrating everything that's out there or praising everything, but that critically engage with the own set of research available. Nonetheless, the review studies are of varying kind and quality. So the studies that I selected to present to my field in this article were one narrative review by Chris Boyatzis from 2024 in an edited volume in a handbook, and one systematic review of admittedly much higher quality, I thought, by Sam Hardy and colleagues from 2019. I'd like, in the next 2 slides, to present to you some key findings that I thought valuable for religious education for each. So Boyatzis, the article is titled Spiritual Development During Childhood and Adolescence, and the title conspicuously leaves out religiosity, and this is by design. To Boyatzis, the field of this strand of research has developed in such a way that spirituality and religiosity are understood as one concept, with religion more or less being a specification of spirituality, a particular kind or a shape that spirituality can take or can develop in. So accordingly, generally, he speaks of spirituality as a general human propensity. And what he presents as a common definition or commonly accepted definition in this strand of research is that spirituality is a person's relational consciousness and sense of connectedness to the transcendent, or what is beyond the self. Clearly a very philosophical or non-denominational way of formulating what spirituality is. He goes on to say that it's commonly accepted that spiritual development takes place in concrete social and historical settings. The development is related to the specific location and time that it takes place in. And religious communities such as churches are one possible environment for the development of spirituality, but not necessarily the one. Of course, he takes a broader approach to this. The research field, he says, is dominated by quantitative studies that measure the intensity of spirituality. Does it increase or decrease? Captured with various items that are not necessarily denominational in nature. But the research generally lacks elaborations of how the participants perceive the meaning of their own spirituality or religiosity. How attached are they, of what import is it to their daily lives or their foundational self-understanding. Taking into account this gap in the research that he points out critically, Boyatzis states that the field, his field, may learn from more recent approaches of religious education researchers who conduct these kinds of qualitative investigations that I mentioned earlier, the domain-specific questions of how young people's concepts of God, humans, Christ, etc. develop. Yeah, I think these are the most relevant aspects of Boyatzis' review, narrative review. If you have questions about this, please note them down and I'm happy to answer them. I'd like to proceed to the next study. If you want to read about it anyway, you find the citation here. It's from the Oxford Handbook of Psychology and Spirituality, the second edition. The first edition did not have this article. The second strand of psychological research that I looked into addresses the processes of influence on of religiosity or spirituality on youth development outcomes. And the article here is by Sam Hardy and colleagues. These youth development outcomes, as I said initially, are broadly conceived. They are, they concern general aspects of youth's positive psychological and social development, their ability to engage with others, their emotional stability, their resistance to, for example, unsafe drug use, and these types of things. Elements commonly regarded as positive youth outcomes. And a large set, or a surprisingly large set of such studies are interested in the mediating factors that help, that might explain the generally positive relationship between religiosity or spirituality and the achievement of such positive youth outcomes. What explains religion's or spirituality's influence on positive development in these terms? The review study found that most often these studies are bivariate, studying only one indicator of positive youth development, for example, aggressive behavior, or the absence of aggressive behavior in relation to narrowly defined understanding of religion or spirituality. For example, a not uncommon example would be how are church attendance among young people, how is church attendance related to pro-social behavior? And less frequently, but still in a considerable amount, these studies conduct mediation studies. They ask about the processes by which religion influences these outcomes. To give you some idea of the numbers, the study, this review study conducted a very thorough systematic review and filtered out studies of lower quality, arriving at 82 mediation studies over a time span of 30 years, and an additional 159 high quality but bivariate studies. An interesting finding of this study was that most often, or the majority of all these studies, focus on negative indicators of youth development, asking, for example, how church attendance would be related to the absence of aggression or the absence of depression or drug use, not other but more difficult to capture elements of youth development, such as, let's say, emotional stability or coping mechanisms. Right? Typically, they relate to the negative definitions of the achievement of these goals. And what was of most interest to me in the study are the findings about what the strongest mediating factors in these positive relationships were. The review found that the strongest mediators across the 82 mediation studies they examined were the personal meaning or the personal appropriation of religion or spirituality by young people, meaning that a sub-factor, a sub-element of religiosity, the personal side of religiosity, was itself the most important mediating factor for explaining the relationship between religiosity generally to positive youth development. This is possible, or this is an interesting finding, because it's not self-explanatory, or it's not entirely common that the studies even ask about.
Can you give an example
for personal appropriation, or
for one of those sub cases?
I hope I can. What's meant by appropriation here would be the question of how important a person's religiosity is to their daily life or in stressful situations, or if they would say that it has helped them in the past, not as opposed to the pure engagement in public religious practices, such as church attendance or prayer in the home or before a meal, or such practical indicators of religiosity. The next strongest mediating factors were peer relationships that are formed in the context of the religious practice, and much less than one might have assumed, or in any case much less, were important the public participation or the religiosity of the parents. I think a finding that flies in the face of a conservative understanding that as long as the family prays together, it stays together and everything will be well. However, I should say that this important factor of appropriation was in the studies almost always understood in an affective sense. How important is it to you? How attached do you personally feel to your religiosity or your practices? And it was not understood as a cognitive process, such as have you worked through doubts about your religion, or have you engaged intellectually with the content of your religious tradition, right? And now this cognitive facet of appropriation is the one that in German religious education would be the most prominent and would be of most interest to us if developmental psychology has something to say about it. Typically, school education does not work to increase the religious fervor or the emotional attachment to the students' religion, but to enable them to critically relate to their own religious tradition. And we see this as a strong factor in working towards the aim of religious education that we follow. What would I point out to you as the implications of this research? Generally speaking, I'd say that neither of these two strands of recent empirical psychological research provides much aid for tailoring the religious learning situations in the way that I said is typically the idea of religious educators of what they can get help with from developmental psychology. So for the very particular teaching work of designing learning environments or learning situations, it's hard to say that the research is of much import. But I would say that several of the basic findings of these two strands help us with reflecting on religious education more broadly, specifically in that they point out the importance of mental well-being and pro-social behavior as developmental categories that are noticeably influenced by spiritual or religious development. I would say that the idea of mental well-being as an indicator of successful religious education is not very prominent in my field presently. Partially because we are so focused on the school context, but also because there is not much expertise and a knowledge basis for these relationships. So this is an area that could contribute to the field of religious education if we engage with it more. Secondly, the studies both pointed out an over-reliance on quantitative studies, particularly on small bivariate studies that define or capture religiosity or spirituality very narrowly, for example, most commonly through church attendance. They state that there is a need for more qualitative studies and more multifaceted understandings of religiosity. And this is very much in accordance with the perspective of religious educators, that indeed there is this gap for qualitative understandings, and that religion is must be conceived of more broadly along the lines of children's and youth theology. And finally, I was happy to see that the researchers themselves pointed out that appropriation should be conceived of both affectively and cognitively. This, especially as I said, this cognitive side of it could be of great value to an updated or more integrated understanding of or version of these stage models that we are still working with. If appropriation, personal appropriation is such an important element of achieving positive youth developments. I was finally very glad to see that the studies were, that the self-criticism stated in the studies overlapped with common criticism from the field of religious education over against developmental psychology. So if we are, if we see the same problems, we might be able to work together to overcome them, as, for example, through a more intensive exchange of knowledge about in the field of qualitative studies for religious and spiritual development. That also would be a next step, I think, one could take. I would encourage religious educators to bring their research into developmental psychology, to engage with the two strands that I presented. And I would hope that perhaps if developmental psychologists see that some of their own criticism is of great interest and would be welcomed, a response to this criticism would be welcomed in the field of theology and religious education, that the conversation may become more intensive and productive. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to engaging with your questions.
Since you say that, given your research, it seems that this doesn't provide you with much information about how to improve religious teaching. I wonder why you don't go into the direction of checking the general rules of good teaching. So leaving autonomy, being empathetic, having competence. So now this is from the self-determination perspective, but there are others as well. And investigating the degree to which they are implemented in religious teaching, for example, as compared to other kinds of teaching, like natural sciences, for example. And then you could see what could you improve. There is one thing, I guess it is obvious that in today's society, people do not just believe because they are kind of educated with natural sciences. So maybe investigating to which degree teachers try to impose knowledge on God, or whether they say, well, this is what they have said in the Bible and so on. Let's see what it tells us for our life, and see whether this is more a smooth way, leaving autonomy, to adopt it and thinking about it, oh well, I think I believe in it, because this is what you say, it's about personal meaning. If it gives you personal meaning, you do not need somebody telling you there is God and there is no question that there is no God. So things like that, and you could investigate these different teaching styles, and if they help, the one helps more to adopt it than the other. And even personality differences may play a role. Some people are easily affected by strong people saying that's the way it is, and others become more reactant, and you need a different approach. So this could be another procedure.
Yes, it would be. I think it would be an interesting procedure to study this and to observe lessons that, at least in certain phases of the lesson, embody these different teaching styles. I would say that this more engaging, open approach, didactic approach, is indeed very common and is the generally accepted ideal in religious education presently. which is why it would be so helpful to get to focus on the cognitive aspect of appropriation from a psychological viewpoint. So when I point out that this is a field of interest, that can be productive, what I had in mind is similar to what you suggested just now. Of course, this more open approach to teaching comes to us through educational studies, which are themselves then related to educational psychology. So it's not like there is no empirical basis for these practices, but in the specific area of developmental psychology concerned with religious and spiritual development, I didn't find studies, didn't find that the review studies discover lots of interest in this particular area. Yeah, but of course, there's always, you can always ask yourself, why not do it yourself? Yeah.
I think you have read the results of KMU6.
Yes.
The so-called Kirchenmitgliedschaftsuntersuchung, a huge empirical study concerning the relationship between spirituality and church bonding. And they found one of the most irritating results they found was the thesis that spirituality is not an individual phenomenon, but depends on the practiced church-formed religiosity. So without a church bonding, yes, the believing on a personal God will collapse, and that what we call spirituality will collapse. And can you bring that in contact with your results? Would you agree here? That is a study design that depends from Detlef Pollack, and that sounds completely different to that what you presented here.
Well, part of a partial explanation of that there is a stark difference in perspectives here, right? One saying that spiritual development takes place everywhere and sometimes in church or religious contexts, right? And it's a human propensity and it's always developing more or less, right? That's the Buyatzis statement. I think a partial explanation would be context of where the data is from, which context is addressed. If the German church membership study looks at German, well, it's not just the Protestant population, but it's broadly the German population that was studied, right? But it's plausible that we would get a different picture for Germany than for the North American context, where most of the data that Buyatzis is surveying is gathered. On a conceptual level, does spirituality collapse if the churches are, lose prominence as places for its formation? I'm not yet convinced that must be true. I think I would need to consult with the study results more specifically to be of more help there. But it's true. I would agree with you that there is a stark difference in perspective between the first review study that I presented and then the current findings from 24 from the church membership.
Yeah, so I'm curious because I like this idea that, okay, so we need a more multifaceted understanding of religiosity in general at play. But, one of the things that really bugs me about the academic study of philosophy of religion, at least, is its overemphasis on, the cognitive aspects over the affective aspects, as opposed to the other way around. But there's, so there's cognitive aspects in the sense of, the content. There's the affective stuff, but there's also religious practice, right? And so I'm just wondering if you could say how, how religious practice itself, like what we do with our bodies, the kinds of rituals that we engage in, so how that sort of, first of all, just out of interest, like how that's currently often taught in Religionsunterricht, but then also how that, you know, how looking at bringing that more into the classroom might also have some sort of relevant effect on development and spiritual development.
There's indeed a recent development to create a body-sensitive didactic approach for religious education. I think this is at the very forefront of didactic developments and is more controversial. But what's already quite established is a performative approach to religious education, meaning that in certain situations it can be helpful to theatrically introduce religious practices into the religious education classroom, and in the mode of play or theatrical play, engage with, for example, a pose of prayer, so that students might experience or experiment with what a person who prays might feel or sense physically as well as emotionally if they assume a certain praying position, and then elaborate, you know, what happened here, how, because indeed the recognition that practice and bodily experience, movements, etc., are as well as sounds and colors and so on and so forth, are an integral part of the shape of religion, and which cannot be dissected from the total of what religion is without losing something.
And do you know of any research that links sort of the performative approach to development at all, or is that?
It's typically evaluated in terms of learning achievement for the students, right? So a long-term development study of students who had performative education, I don't know of such a story, of such a study. And again, it would be very difficult to separate that, because the students or the teachers don't just employ one mode of teaching all the time, or you know, for a year or whatever. On a consensus-based consensus database basis, I would say it's generally accepted among religious educators that it's a helpful mode for teaching. That also contributes to a strong personal engagement, right? Students might discover how strongly or not they are personally involved with religious tradition or elements of religious tradition. Yeah, through such practices. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There has been, especially among theologians, anthropologists, but there's also a little bit of empirical research that being religious does not only lead to pro-social behavior, but to a certain form of aggression. And there was this idea that monotheistic religions give you the authority to be aggressive because you are im Auftrag des Herrn unterwegs. What is the expression?
On a mission from God.
You're entitled.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, you're entitled, or you're on a mission by God. And so, to the extreme forms like terrorism, yeah, like the terrorists of 9/11 prayed before they actually hijacked the planes, assuming to get some kind of a divine authorization for this. Has there ever been a study whether religious education, reading certain religious texts, leads to similar antisocial or aggressive behavior among children? That would be, or youth. That would be interesting.
One result in this line of thinking that I found that's also reported by Hardy and colleagues is that certain modes of intrusive or imposing religious education or forcing young people into a religious tradition is related to the youth development outcomes in this negative sense. So it can further depression, it can further antisocial behavior, mostly depression really, if a sense of over-identification against the will or interest of young people is imposed. So this would, again, foster or lend importance to an open approach to teaching, of course. That's not a desirable outcome, but it is a positive relationship between these elements. In my understanding, it makes a difference whether you try to indoctrinate people into legitimizing violence, religious violence, and understanding it as justified and or necessary even, in the sense that terrorism would portray it. It's a difference, it can be distinguished from a reaction or a tendency in behavior in everyday life, which is what's of most interest to these studies. I mean, looking at how indoctrination or radicalization works, it takes a lot of work and energy to convince and form people who identify with such an ideology, right? It takes a setting of intense control and a high degree of social engagement in a radicalized community, for example, and constant teaching and indoctrination until a terrorist or a person becomes a reliable terrorist. So I think we don't have to be worried that a certain text or an individual topic in religious education increases this outcome. I think it's still it's actually hard to turn people into terrorists. So we don't run the risk of accidentally creating them through selecting the wrong texts or topics in religious education classes.